Heard here, the March of the Consular Guard was first performed on the occasion of Napoleon's arrival at the Tuileries Palace in Paris in February of 1800, as the newly instated First Consul of France. The palace's previous occupant, King Louis XVI, had been effectively imprisoned there from October of 1789 until his execution on the guillotine some 3 years later. Against this backdrop, the palace's new resident would symbolize a middle ground, as it were, between the deep-seated autocratic traditions of the former monarchy and the violent populism of the Revolution. Since the founding of the Republic, France had undergone a series of increasingly ineffectual regimes to arrive at a unitary executive akin to the American presidency. Europe would present a very different setting than America, however, and as First Consul, Napoleon would be obliged to tread a very narrow path between the pomp and pageantry of long tradition on one side and the rabidly anti-monarchist sentiments of the masses on the other. Circumstances would call for a highly regimented sort of march indeed, and how he came to acquire and secure his new role will be the subject of our current reading from Quest for Empire. 6 weeks after embarking from Alexandria, Egypt, Napoleon landed on the French coast near Nice, and by the 16th of October, 1799, he was in Paris. At this point, he had not seen Josephine in nearly a year and a half, yet their reunion was not entirely joyous. As early as July of the previous year, news of his wife's extended affair with a hussar lieutenant had reached Napoleon in Egypt, and in addition to his deep personal upset at the discovery, he suffered further humiliation when letters in which he vowed to divorce her were captured and published in the English press. Already bitterly disillusioned, he arrived at Malmaison, the quiet estate that Josephine had purchased in his absence, to find it lavishly redecorated and no sign of Josephine. She appeared 2 days later, having tried to meet him on his way north and mistaken his route. Though he eventually forgave her infidelity, the episode left the relationship essentially altered, with Napoleon very much in control, and thus the marriage continued on a less romantic footing. Meanwhile, a perceptible malaise had permeated the French capital, where unemployment and inflation were rampant, and speculation about an eventual return to Bourbon rule was being brooded about in the cafes. Of the 5 directors who had headed the government upon Napoleon's departure for Egypt, only Paul Barras was still in power. Indeed, Barras had grown rich from the sale of public offices and would be implicated in a royalist plot. The situation was worse than Napoleon had imagined, and his popularity throughout the country now compelled him to seek a role of political leadership. His first thought was to seek election to the Directory, but the Constitution stipulated that no one under 40 could sit on the ruling panel, and at 30 he was not even close. At a loss as to how to proceed, he met with one of the sitting directors, Joseph Sieyès, who in turn had been eager to enlist the support of the newly returned military hero. Though Napoleon personally detested Sieyès, and for his part Sieyès had no intention of helping the general wrest political leadership from the ruling class of lawyers of which he was a part. Together, the two decided on a scheme to dismantle the Directory and create a new regime. Using his influence in the existing government, Sieyès prevailed upon 3 of his fellow directors to resign, while a new constitution was formulated by the legislature. At the same time, with the government clearly in transition, Napoleon invited a group of senior army officers to join him on a journey. Dressed in civilian clothes and presenting himself as a moderate capable of reconciling royalist and republican factions, he enlisted the army chiefs in a planned coup d'etat, winning them over one by one in private conversations. The coup was to be carried out on the 10th of November, 1799, 19 Brumaire, according to the season-based revolutionary calendar. On this day, At Sieyes' prompting, an emergency session of the council was to meet in the Paris suburb of Saint-Cloud, and out of concern for its safety, General Bonaparte was placed in charge of all troops in the Paris district. With a number of key figures supporting his bid for political leadership, including his brother Lucien, president of the 500, it remained for Napoleon to put the best possible light on the planned takeover. Exercising de facto power at the head of the legislative guard, he planned to attend the meeting and present himself to the council in the role of savior of the Republic, fresh from the conquest of Egypt. On the foggy morning of 19 Brumaire, he arrived at Saint-Cloud to discover that the meeting of the elders had been delayed until the rooms in which they were to deliberate could be furnished in a suitably elegant and imposing style. It was mid-afternoon before such conditions were met, and when at last the group came to a decision, it was not to create a new constitution, as he had hoped, but to prepare for the election of 4 new directors according to the existing document. At this point, Napoleon entered the hall and began to speak. Swearing allegiance to the Republic, he warned of various conspiracies currently afoot, naming 2 directors, Barras and Moulin, who had approached him with plans to overthrow the existing government. He then offered to save the elders from such dangers, and alluding to the soldiers that awaited outside the hall, he boasted, "With them I have founded republics." The 250 members of the elders did not quite know what to make of this. Though many were openly sympathetic to him, there was a general buzz of bewilderment and disapproval. His were not the words of a parliamentarian, and as the legislators drew back, Napoleon grew more frustrated and impatient, increasing the pitch of his inflammatory rhetoric. Perhaps recalling the danger he had faced at the time of the Terror, he threatened to crush anyone who might seek to outlaw him, and in a final flourish of bombast reminded the assembly that he marched accompanied by the god of victory and the god of fortune. With this, he lost his audience altogether. These were not soldiers to be led with fiery slogans, but statesmen attuned to rhetorical subtlety. And amid angry outcries, he was ushered from the hall. With the strident voices of the elders still ringing in his ears, Napoleon now strode into the larger and less formal hall where the Council of the 500 was in session. Here he no sooner made his appearance than cries arose to outlaw him, and he was set upon by angry members who physically accosted him, leaving scratches on his face. Visibly shaken, he was rescued from further violence by 4 grenadiers who escorted him out of the hall. Next, his brother Lucien, president of the assembly, having failed to persuade the members to allow Napoleon to speak, offered to resign his office, to which the deputies responded by reassuring him of their confidence. In the process, a semblance of order was restored, and during this interval, Lucien sent a hurried note to Napoleon, calling upon him to act quickly. For once, however, Napoleon was utterly stymied, for the idea of taking over the government by force violated his sense of both deserving and destiny. When nothing happened for half an hour, another squad of grenadiers entered the assembly to lead Lucien out. Now, at the urging of Sieyes, the 2 brothers determined to clear the hall. Addressing the soldiers of the legislative guard, Lucien reported that a group of fanatics was threatening the lawful proceedings of the 500. Napoleon, his face still bloody from his encounter with the angry deputies, spoke of having escaped with his life. Convinced of their duty, the soldiers fixed bayonets and entered the hall, stampeding the representatives of the people, who fled by every available means of egress. Several hours later, duly intimidated, a portion of the council was reconvened, and both legislative bodies voted for a provisional government to be ruled by 3 consuls, Joseph Sieyes, Pierre Ducos, and the hero of the hour, as the pamphlets he had printed would portray him, Napoleon Bonaparte. While Napoleon had clearly wished to gain political office under less coercive circumstances, it was not a time to quibble about methods. Europe was entering a new century, and if the ideals of the Revolution were to survive, they would have to be reconciled with the realities of the present. Thus, with supreme confidence in his ability to articulate those ideals, Napoleon set to work. The first order of business was to secure a legal basis for the new regime, to which end a new constitution was rammed through an abbreviated legislative process and declared to be in force in advance of the national plebiscite that was to give it popular approval. Meanwhile, with little regard for the legitimacy of the council's initial ruling, he convinced his fellow consuls to accept positions as senators, while he himself became First Consul with broad powers. Thus, in a remarkably short period, the government reverted to a virtual dictatorship. Even so, given the trend of recent events, the French populace came to accept the new order with remarkable equanimity. After years of indecision, turmoil, and corruption, an era of governmental expedience came as a welcome change. Many Frenchmen supposed that Bonaparte represented an end to the revolution and a transition back to Bourbon rule, and indeed the effect of many of Napoleon's efforts was reminiscent of the recent past, invoking a sense of order and stability all but forgotten in French society. Nowhere would this transition be more salutary, perhaps, than in the area of finance. Upon the advent of the consulate, the government's exchequer contained less than 200,000 francs, with outstanding debts of close to 500 million. Government workers hadn't been paid in close to a year, nor was there a uniform process for paying or resupplying of the army. While the officials of the Directory had grown fat from graft and corruption, the government itself had been left on the verge of bankruptcy. Guided by the experience of funding his campaigns at the expense of the conquered, and by his own native thrift, Napoleon moved quickly to confront the problem. Raising close to 15 million francs from borrowing and lottery proceeds, he covered the government's immediate debts and set about reorganizing the collection of taxes, a task previously managed by part-time collectors on an irregular basis. Applying a new standard of administrative discipline to the process, the new First Consul made tax collection a full-time job and required that collectors pay the government a percentage of their expected revenues in advance, instilling in them a keen sense of diligence toward the work. Further, in an effort to institutionalize budgetary responsibility within the government, he created two separate entities, the Treasury and the Ministry of Finance, with oversight of income and expenses, respectively. The adversarial nature of the two bodies provided a built-in disciplinary mechanism, serving to balance the budget and keep it in balance throughout the consulate years. The same sort of discipline would be applied to the hopeless jumble of laws, jurisdictions, and decrees that comprised the French legal system. Moving with characteristic dispatch, Napoleon would give a commission of 4 respected jurists 6 months to provide the outline for a new system that would combine the enlightened ideas of the Revolution with the best principles of traditional French law. Drafted as early as December 1800, though not passed until 1804, the resulting civil code, known as the Code Napoleon, would bring much-needed coherence and uniformity to the administration of justice, becoming a long-standing model of legal reform. From finance to law, from education to infrastructure, there was scarcely a facet of French life that did not undergo dramatic improvement under the consulate. Like Caesar Augustus, Napoleon proved as gifted a civil administrator as he was a military commander, taking a firm hold of political power and bringing order and discipline to a growing empire. And like Augustus, he would do so largely in abeyance of the republican ideals which he presumed to champion. Though his dictatorial methods would be condemned by contemporaries and historians alike, given the volatile political circumstances under which he had assumed power, it is difficult to imagine how he might have proceeded or the Republic might have endured by any other means. Yet for all of his success in consolidating power unto himself, his situation during the early years of the consulate was anything but secure. In addition to ongoing domestic unrest, the country continued to be surrounded by hostile states, prepared to invade at the slightest sign of weakness. Responding to this external threat as early as January 1800, Napoleon gave orders for the creation of a reserve army of 60,000 men to be organized at Dijon under his trusted chief of staff, General Berthier. Though as a civilian leader, the First Consul was not technically allowed to lead an army in the field, the reserve army would be his to command, and with his own political future at stake, he could scarcely afford to have it any other way. If experience had taught him anything, it was that success on the battlefield was the surest way to secure the confidence of the French nation. At the time Napoleon assumed political power in the coup d'etat of 19 Brumaire, France had been at war with a coalition of European monarchies for over a year, during which much of the territorial gains he had achieved in the Italian campaign had been erased. Eager to avenge their earlier losses, the Austrians had assembled an army of 128,000 men under the hard-fighting Michael Melas, and were well on their way to recovering virtually all of their former territory in Lombardy and Piedmont. Facing this massive presence in and around Genoa was an army of 36,000 hard-used, ill-fed, and ragged French troops under André Massena, a wily veteran of the Italian campaign. Meanwhile, the largest of the French armies, more than 100,000 men commanded by General Moreau, was situated along the upper Rhine, confronting a slightly larger Austrian force under Baron Kray. Strategically located between these two fronts, and in a position to support either, was the newly gathered reserve army at Dijon. Uncertain in which direction to advance, First Consul Bonaparte had deliberately left his options open. His uncertainty came to an end in April 1800, when Melas went on the attack, isolating Massena's army in Genoa and threatening to starve it into submission. In response, Napoleon planned a counterstroke in which the reserve army would march through the high passes of the Alps and descend on Melas's army from the north. Though moving large masses of men and equipment through the snow-bound mountain passes presented a daunting challenge in itself, if successful, the plan promised to restore much of northern Italy at a single blow. In addition, the feat promised to recall Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps during the Second Punic War, a comparison that scarcely offended Napoleon's sense of destiny. Ordering Massena to hold Genoa and thereby tie up the greater part of Melas's force, Napoleon determined on a primary route from the vicinity of Geneva through the Great St. Bernard Pass, and on the 1st of May the arduous crossing began. Meanwhile, outlying detachments advanced along the nearby Simplon and Gotthard passes, creating a kind of shell game by which to confuse the enemy. By the 19th of May, the bulk of the army had made its way across the Great St. Bernard, running up against the first enemy resistance at Fort Bard, an all but impregnable stronghold on the southern slope of the range. Resorting to nearby mountain paths, the French vanguard was able to circumvent the obstacle and proceed to Ivrea, at which point it turned eastward toward Milan. Surrounding the city on the 2nd of June, Napoleon pressed southward to close the door on any enemy forces attempting to escape down the valley of the Po. Having initially concentrated his forces in the vicinity of Turin, Melas responded to the French incursion by shifting eastward to cover his line of communication. With Massena's isolated force on the verge of capitulation in Genoa, however, Melas refused to withdraw down the Po, seeking instead to hold his ground in Piedmont. His decision was affirmed on the 4th of June when Massena was compelled to surrender, enabling Austrian coastal forces to join the main army at the fortified town of Alessandria. At this point, though their communications along the Po had been cut, the Austrians were in a position to retire, if necessary, upon Genoa, where they could enlist the aid of the Royal Navy. Determined to prevent this, Napoleon pressed forward, hoping to cut them off and bring on a major battle in open country. About this time, the 11th of June, General Desaix, conqueror of the Upper Nile, arrived in the French camp at the end of a long and perilous journey from Egypt. Napoleon had ordered Desaix's return in recognition of the general's brilliant pursuit of his Egyptian foe, Murad Bey, and upon his arrival, a newly organized corps was placed under his command. Approaching Alessandria from the east on the 12th, Napoleon recognized in the broad plain surrounding the town of Marengo a likely field upon which the Austrians might seek to deploy their cavalry. Yet despite isolated reports of enemy activity, there was no clear indication of the whereabouts of Melas's main force. The question lingered throughout the next day, causing Napoleon increasing concern. Fearful that Melas might yet escape to the south, he ordered Generals Lannes and Victor to advance their corps as far as Marengo, holding Desaix's troops in reserve along the road to Genoa. As night fell, the last of a series of rain showers made preparations for encampment difficult, and as a result, few defensive precautions were taken. About 6 a.m. on the 14th of June, 1800, the Austrians began marching out of Alessandria, filing over a series of bridges across the Bormida River and advancing upon Marengo. Though the attack took the French largely by surprise, the men of Victor's corps made a stubborn defense of the town, holding up the Austrian advance long enough to allow Lannes' troops to come into line on their right. Even as the fighting in Marengo grew more heated, however, Napoleon made little effort to bring up reinforcements, convinced that the attack was merely a feint designed to cover Melas's escape to the south with the bulk of his army. Thus, despite reports that the Austrians were advancing upon Marengo in force, he sent orders for Desaix to march to Novi, some 10 miles away, while General Lepoip was ordered north to cover any escape down the Po. Luckily for the French, difficulties in crossing the rain-swollen Scrivia River held up Desaix's advance, and as the morning wore on, the increasing thunder of guns in the direction of Marengo gave the general pause. Having sent a cavalry attachment ahead to confirm the absence of enemy forces in Novi, Desaix was loath to continue his march, which stood in contradiction of a central tenet of warfare: always march toward, not away from the sound of the guns. Back in Marengo, Victor's corps had succeeded in repelling the initial Austrian assault only to discover fresh enemy battle lines advancing upon their position, even as Austrian artillery continued to take a heavy toll. With Lannes' corps fully committed and the French reserves far from the field, the situation was growing more critical by the moment. At this point, Napoleon, who thus far had stuck tenaciously to his own overwrought interpretation of events, rode forward to survey the fighting and realized his mistake. Suddenly alive to the presence of Melas's main army and his own strategic vulnerability, he ordered all uncommitted troops forward and sent messages for Desaix and Lepoip to return at once. It was nearly 10 o'clock. Meanwhile, the Austrians continued to batter away at the 2 French corps defending the town. Though Melas's advance had not been particularly well orchestrated, it was none the less deliberate, and as the main attack pressed across Fontenoy Creek, a flanking force was ordered forward. Their objective accomplished, the Austrian detachment veered south against the exposed French flank, overwhelming a combined force of cavalry and infantry thrown forward by Lannes, and pressing on toward the French rear. At the same time, another Austrian frontal assault on the town, the 5th, succeeded in breaking Victor's line, sending the French left reeling. Soon the Austrians were advancing along the entire front, scooping up abandoned guns as they went. As Lannes' men streamed eastward, the first French reinforcements arrived and were thrown in to stabilize the right flank. The effort proved too little too late, however, and with the rest of the army falling back in confusion, Napoleon was quickly running out of options. By 3 o'clock, with the French everywhere on the run, the battle seemed all but over. The Austrians had only to continue their advance and mop up the enemy's shattered units. Indeed, now certain of success, the 71-year-old Melas turned over command to his second-in-command, General Caim, and made his way back to Alessandria to draft his victory report. By this time, however, Desaix had received a hastily scribbled order, "Return for God's sake," and was driving hard for San Giuliano, leaving the highway to march cross-country toward the sights and sounds of the battle raging in the distance. Upon his arrival, he conferred with Napoleon and quickly offered to lead a counterattack. "The battle has been lost," he is reported to have said. "There is time to win another." Bringing his troops into line on either side of the road leading back to Marengo, he waited while Lannes and Victor reformed their battered corps on his right, a unit of the guard on their flank. About 5 o'clock, with a total of 18 guns in position north of the road, the French were ready to receive the advancing Austrians. Nearly as disorganized by success as the French were by retreat, the Austrians had spent much of the previous 2 hours reforming in and around Marengo, Melas's departure from the field having contributed to a general lack of direction. Now they came up in line of battle on the south side of the road, preparing to give the demoralized French a final push that would send them packing. Instead, they met the 9th Light Infantry, fresh to the battle, who delivered a single concerted volley that brought the Austrians up short. French batteries from across the road now opened up, and by the time the dust cleared away, so had the attacking brigade. Next, a unit of Austrian grenadiers shouldered their way forward and leveled a series of volleys at the men of the 9th Light, staggering them. As the French fell back south of the road, Desaix rose in his saddle and prepared to lead the rest of his troops in an assault immediately to the north. No sooner had they stepped off, however, than Desaix tumbled from his saddle, shot through the heart. The battle had now reached its ultimate crisis. With the French left in retreat, and its right now leaderless, the Austrian grenadiers seemed poised to deliver a final blow. It was at this moment, however, that French cavalry commander François Kellerman, son of the hero of Valmy, spurred his brigade forward, swinging around Desaix's troops and rushing against the enemy's exposed flank. Preceded by a hail of canister shot, the French horsemen crashed into and through the grenadiers, never stopping until they had likewise stampeded a regiment of Austrian dragoons moving up in support. Their front broken and dispersed, some 1,700 grenadiers were captured. The Austrians fled back down the road to Marengo, carrying away 4 brigades as they went. Shortly thereafter, an Austrian division advanced in the direction of La Galena, only to find the enemy surging back across the entire front. In the space of half an hour, the momentum of the battle had dramatically reversed, and the French would not repeat the Austrians' failure to maintain contact with the fleeing foe. Pursued and pursuers now retraced the 4 miles back to Marengo, where the Austrians attempted a last abortive stand, only to be overwhelmed and stampeded once again. By nightfall, what remained of Melas's army had reached the safety of their bridgehead on the Bormida, but the campaign was effectively over. The next day, Melas signed an armistice, ceding to France all of northern Italy as far east as the Mincio River. Thoughts of what might have resulted had he remained in the field during the previous day's fighting could hardly have escaped him. For the space of several hours, the opportunity to deliver a crippling blow to the French war effort had been within his grasp. Over the course of the next decade and more, such opportunities would not come again. In the end, French casualties at Marengo amounted to some 6,000 men, while the Austrians lost 9,400 dead and wounded, as well as 8,000 captured. Though the battle had turned on the narrowest of chances, Napoleon wasted no time in capitalizing on the political spoils and playing up his role in the victory. His battle report, printed on his own portable press as a bulletin from the field, characterized the initial French withdrawal as a deliberate tactic designed to draw the Austrians into a trap, representing Desaix's counterattack as a well-conceived stratagem from the first. This, of course, was a piece of pure fiction, yet such reports were soon to become something of a trademark of the period, inflated accounts of French victories eventually giving rise to a popular expression for all less than truthful sources of information, which were said to lie like a bulletin. Nevertheless, his record of invincibility intact, Napoleon returned to Paris to begin building up and re-equipping his forces in anticipation of the inevitable renewal of the war. On the 3rd of December, 1800, General Moreau defeated Archduke John at Hohenlinden, opening the door to a rapid advance as far as Molk, some 40 miles from Vienna. Meanwhile, to the south, the army of Italy, under Brune, pushed the enemy back beyond the Tagliamento. Finally, in February 1801, the Austrians negotiated a formal treaty, the Peace of Luneville, and fighting between the two countries once again came to an end, if only temporarily. With France's main adversary on the continent now out of the war, Napoleon focused his attention on England, and once again considered a cross-channel invasion, massing troops in and around the Channel ports. At the same time, aided by an anti-English alliance between Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and Denmark, he took steps to implement a continental blockade of English goods. Shortly thereafter, upon the assassination of Tsar Paul, the pro-English Alexander came to power in Russia, ending the Baltic Alliance. But by March of 1802, the English had signed the Treaty of Amiens, bringing an end to this stage of the war. At this point, having reformed many French institutions and successfully negotiated peace with France's enemies, Napoleon saw his popularity soar, and in a carefully orchestrated plebiscite, he was named First Consul for life by a grateful French nation.